Did it actually start on the East Coast, on the West Coast? Who started it?
I have to say, I think I first took note of it through Mitch. Like I think it was Mitch who I saw tweeting about it, and I think making me feel quite bad about thinking about anything else. And then the thing that got me started was really when Jenny got the ball rolling with making files available, and more of a kind of official call to arms. I think Mitch's I saw was like lots of tweets, and then Jenny's was kind of like literally like, this is a game plan spelled out, and if you want to do the same, follow these steps. Mm-hmm. So thank you to both of you.
So it did start on the East Coast.
Why are you so concerned with East versus West Coast?
Well, no, but I think it's interesting that, initially...
It's like a hip-hop battle.
Yeah.
But
it's Biggie right here.
Yeah, wow,
So when
So
go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think in the States, at least from what I'm aware of, the initial initiatives launched on the East Coast. But it's really been I think a global effort, depending on, areas of, peaks. And there are clusters in Spain, for example, and I know in Italy. So that it's very much a global collective and collaborative thing around PPE.
So how did this all first start? Give us some dates and understanding of, because we're aware of the projects, but it's kind of funny. It seems like with maybe the project in general, or actually maybe the pandemic in general, the start dates are a bit blurry. And in part because I think specifically with COVID-19, we weren't sure exactly what it was or how much it was going to affect things until it kind of snowballed very quickly. So at what point did Project PPE come online?
The tweet that Alvin is talking about that I sent out was in probably mid-March. I think it was only 4 weeks ago, even though it feels like forever, maybe 5 weeks ago. And, we had already at Princeton, it had become clear that the whole semester was going to be virtual. Mm-hmm. And so everyone was sort of just processing that. And I have different projects. I'm doing two projects in New Orleans, one speculative and one a client project. And so I was following through New Orleans what was happening, because it was a very different timeline there. And the tweet that Alvin is talking about was me responding to the AIA when they came out with a message saying, for all the architects who are at home relaxing, here's some great books to read, here's a book list. And it just seemed so even more tone deaf than usual for the AIA. And so I thought, here's this association that could be taking a stand, whether at the political level or just, directing us of how we can take our skills and our resources and our machines and put them to use. And so to me, the most obvious thing, and I've been seeing this, reported on the news for weeks already, was the shortage of PPE. And so I said, why aren't we 3D printing PPE? And then once I did that, and my criticisms of the AIA, I think they tend to get some traction, probably just because the people following me are often maybe critical of the same organization for the same reasons. But then I realized, well, why am I not doing anything? I'm technically a professor at Princeton now. I'm sort of part of these institutions as well. And so then it catapulted me to reach out to Jenny, first to do kind of my own research, and then to reach out to Jenny, just not even knowing really about what Jenny was doing, but just kind of just having an intuition that Jenny would be one of the people who would be critical in this.
So the two of you sort of teamed up. But when you started, it's not like you had a background in, personal protective equipment or masks or anything like this. So how did that process work?
The bridge has been through 3D printing and kind of space of design and creativity and emerging technologies that spans disciplines. And, at least for our network, that's allowed us to, to grow and to respond really rapidly and efficiently and effectively. So, no, I mean, I certainly would never profess to have expertise and, knowledge in the design and engineering and production of PPE and medical products. But we can help through the way that we think and the way that we work with these machines. And I mean, I've been working with 3D printers for over a decade now, so it seemed really obvious that we could leverage that. And, you know, the conversation that Mitch and I had initially, it wasn't even really about the SHIELD project. It was sort of opening a dialogue that, you know, is around a really fluid situation and wanting to come together and to innovate and, you know, share tools and to really treat the collaboration as an organic process. And I think it has been that. And on the Cornell end, I mean, things started about a month ago, but it was late one Tuesday night, actually March 24th, that an email went around to a few of us around campus, and I received a note from a colleague and collaborator, Kirsten Peterson, who's in engineering. And basically, while Cornell Medicine put out an urgent call across Cornell to help with the production of shields, protective shields. And thankfully, they had tested one particular design, which is by 3D Verkstan. They're based in Sweden, and had verified that it was, you know, it would work. It was a good product. And so we were able to immediately take action. And so what started out with just a few labs on our campus, you know, soon grew. And so both Kirsten and I and colleagues in computer science immediately got to work, and with the support of my dean, Mi-Jin Yoon, within less than 8 hours, we had our largest digital fabrication lab fired up. I received clearance to enter my lab and get my machines going. And then we pushed it out to our students and faculty and staff. And so students who had brought printers home started printing. And then Mi-Jin sent it out to our New York-based alumni architects. And then they sent it out to their network. So within less than 48 hours, we went from a few labs to Big and Grimshaw and KPF and Weissman Freddie and, you know, a whole slew of architects getting involved and firing up their labs and leveraging their network. So, I mean, for us, you know, you ask how it got started, but it's the informal democratic space that 3D printing affords that has allowed us to, you know, supply a huge demand and a gap in the supply chain really effectively and to work in a, you know, positive manner.
Several hours ago.
Because, I mean, honestly, like 3D printing these things is really stupid. one 3D printer is not going to make an impact. But when you have thousands coming together and collectively, you know, working, it's the power of the network and people, you know, really pitching in that allows for that immediate response. And so I knew that if we were going to scale and to get other people involved, this kind of references Alvin's comment, we made some smart decisions really early on. So I put all of the files on my lab website with, you know, documents. We set up a Slack channel just to get out, you know, the word and the files and instructions and, you know, just to let people know effectively and immediately how to start. But yeah, I think the space of 3D printing and what I would call informal fabrication has shown itself to be a really powerful thing. And I'm excited to see where this goes in the future too. You know, that I think we've discovered a way of working together that is really powerful and, you know, can make change. I've been collaborating with people across disciplines for a number of years, like over 15 years now, and I've never collaborated with so many people I've never met.
Right. I mean, I think it's really fantastic to hear you say that and how it's worked out. And I know one of the frustrations with large institutions, and especially in this case with the pandemic, is how slowly they are to react and to respond to things. And I think that's a feeling that a lot of people have. And especially when, you know, you're in the United States and we're a pretty affluent country, it's like, why can't we do this quicker?
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing to hear that the advantages of something like 3D printing technology, the informal productions that you're kind of, however you described it, you know, actually worked in this case and worked at a time when it's needed. And it's not a theoretical thing that's used for just fun project. Like, it can actually be put into use for something much more real. That's incredible.
I want to jump in there. I think that's super important, especially this idea of kind of where we go from here, which, I mean, it's not known, right? But for me, some of the things that become significant are that we have this legacy now of at least one generation of architects, maybe at this point two, who have been thinking about alternatives to industrial production and working on advanced geometry or portability, right? And kind of temporary kind of making systems. And so if we can't jump in a situation like this, then I worry about what we've been building these capacities for, is one thing. The second thing is that in this century, it seems to be that we will always be in some mode of crisis, right? Whether it's the crisis of the Anthropocene or some form of racial justice or economic inequality or some other version of a combination of all of these things and their aftermaths. So that if we also, as a discipline, you know, need the kind of stability of the studio as we know it in order to engage with the world, then I also worry about us as a discipline, because when will we ever really be in that position? Except when we have kind of cornered ourselves off from most of the realities of the world. This is a century of ongoing crises that we're in the midst of. So to me, the work that we're doing now is important, and it feels like it needs to change us also, right? That it's not just us going into a situation to change the situation, but it also needs to change us.
I think there's something important about that, which is about the context of us and the context of us as a discipline. And I mean that in a way where think about what is, let's say, happened with music as an example, or film as an example. Like we can trace back political movements and political contexts as the sort of shaping of musical movements or musical efforts, in whether or not it's the Vietnam War or it's, you know, the kind of crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s, or, you know, all of these things that have really kind of shaped culture. And I think that architecture is not outside of that realm, right? In terms of our authorship is actually something that is always a response to current social or political situations. So I don't think it's any coincidence or any lack of coincidence that, let's say, the idea of spatial activism or spatial justice has become more of a movement within architectural circles in the last 6 years, you could say, right? Like the kind of current political situations, whether they are our current front office or Brexit or refugee crisis around the world, are fueling all of these sort of shifts. And I think it's also probably no coincidence that of the three people or many people that are involved in producing the PPE in architectural circles, they happen to be people whose, let's say, architectural history has always been in working with computation and digital fabrication. And so the kind of reflexive responses are to think through the technologies or think through the kind of techniques that you're already leveraging, and you learn to use them as weapons that you can point at certain things, right? And in this case, a particular target popped up very quickly that, you know, was a vital target for each of us to adjust to. But I would also argue that we're not doing such a good job at it, or let's say the success of it is not that successful, not because what we're doing is not successful, but because the battle is so uphill. I mean, I had a recent call with the mayor's office here in Los Angeles, and we're really proud of ourselves for producing, you know, 2,000 something masks in less than a little over a week, and mobilizing 200 something people, and we're getting all these 3D printers and doing all this stuff. And when I talked to the mayor, and they said the burn rate on masks in this city, in just the hospitals alone, is 15,000 per day.
Wow.
And so whatever we're doing, like we
not
can't
enough,
keep up. Like, it's impossible.
So
Yeah, I mean, the original call from Weill Cornell Medicine, they estimated that in New York City alone, they would need at least 25,000 protective face shields a day. And we've produced to date in almost a month, close to 20,000. So,
wow.
I mean, it's a drop in the bucket, but it's something, it is something.
But what that does for me personally, anyways, is the deeper I get into this, and like, it's funny because me and Jenny have been reaching out back and forth trying to coordinate, and then realize that we're going to be on like 2 Zoom calls back to back on the same day. But like, one of the things I wanted to talk with her about is the fact that like I kind of oscillate between this motivation of doing this work and like pure outrage, like just pure anger of like, why the fuck am I doing this in the first place? Like why do I I'm an architect, I'm an educator, I'm an academic, I'm a father, I'm like all of the things I am. None of them is manufacturer of medical equipment, right? Or distributor of medical equipment, or let's say somebody that should be thinking about these things. And our states should not be fighting each other for the same resources. Our hospitals should not be fighting each other for the same resources. And we should not be at all thinking about the fact that, our stimulus checks are going to be signed by somebody.
Yeah, I've experienced similar oscillations, Alvin, from utter just despair and anger and depression over the acute realization of the extents of the situation and how big it is, and then swinging to elation in terms of the fact that we can actually help. And I think for me, seeing how my students have benefited, positively, students who have been disbanded, to their homes, some living locally, others moving back to wherever home is, the fact that they have something to hold on to that makes them feel connected and contributing. I think there are other positives in this that are not just about, the production of the PPE, but yeah, it's tough. It's rough.
I think that emotional reality is so important. That I think that the cool, level-headed, rational architect of the 20th century, I don't want to say needs to die, but it just does not feel like the person that I trust, And I think for us to be able to work with that anger and work through it and oscillate in it, I think we can bring that to questions of housing, right? We can bring that to questions that are kind of closer to our discipline as we've known them. And it will, I think, make us better.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things to unpack in this conversation already. And the funny thing is, like, we had a list of topics and you guys already covered all the topics in a way or brought them up on your own, which is fantastic. But some more specific, like basic information that we are wondering, because I know listeners are familiar with the project, but maybe not super familiar. So how many people have participated in this? And also, it's our understanding that there are a couple different types of protective equipment, right? You have the shield versus the actual mask, or however you would describe it.
Yeah, on our end, in the kind of New York regional network, we have over 200 labs and individuals and offices contributing. And I think we have within that network somewhere around 250 3D printers. It might be a bit more. I should check our spreadsheet. But those are the numbers. And as I mentioned, we've primarily focused on the protective face shield, but at the same time, innovating products that we basically received a list from Weill Cornell Medicine of products that they estimate will be in demand very shortly. And so trying to figure out, what types of products we could potentially then push out to the network and say, okay, we're no longer doing face shields. We're now printing the mask for non-deep breathers versus other products that can be mass produced in volume, hopefully by a manufacturer. And then Mitch and I have had some really great conversations, sharing tools and talking about various types of PPE that, I know you've been working on the face harness as something that you saw as potentially being of need. So there's, I think, been multiple prongs being pursued, but in terms of production, we've primarily focused on the visor and the shield fabrication.
And the mask itself, from what we've seen or read, is it's actually reusable because the filtering part is something that you would replace, or it's cleanable.
So we're producing what we're calling a pseudo N95 mask, and it's not something we designed. There's a kind of misnomer out there that I think a lot of people think that we designed it or are designers that are doing it. And I keep reminding the team that we're working with that in this capacity we are not designers. We're just muscle. We're production, and that's all we are. Because for one, and liabilities come up repeatedly as an issue in terms of we're not medical professionals, and I could go on about the things about what the aesthetics are, but that's obviously not the issue. But yeah, so our masks are reusable. They are three pieces. There's a hard shell. Actually, there's one right here. Well, it doesn't show up real well in the virtual background. But there's three parts: a hard shell, a cap, and then a grid filter on the back, and then the Honeywell HEPA filter gets inserted in the middle, which is a product that's available a lot of places. Buy it on Amazon or Home Depot. Then it also has to get a rubber gasket around the perimeter, which can be off-the-shelf weather stripping. And so the weather strip gives it a permanent seal against the face. The filter provides the kind of breathing apparatus. Also has to be noted that it has to be a Honeywell HEPA fabric filter, because they also have Honeywell fiberglass filters, which you don't want to breathe through.
Yeah.
And then an elastic strap around the back. And so the filters are themselves not reusable. The masks are, but the masks have to be sterilized. So what we do is we only produce raw 3D printed parts. We deliver to Keck Medicine, which is our medical partner. Keck Medicine takes all of our parts, sterilizes our parts, and then in a clean, sterilized space, they do all of the assembly. So we don't assemble anything.
Okay.
Basically, if we were to assemble, they would receive it and then take it apart and sterilize it and then put it back together. So it doesn't make any sense in that respect. But it also has to be said that what we are producing is called a pseudo N95 because it is not an N95. And these are meant to be, so this might be the scariest thing I heard through this whole process was my initial meeting with Keck, when I brought up the fact that our 3D prints, like I did some research, and if you look at a microscopic level, they're not airtight. Like they're not guaranteed to be airtight. There are inconsistencies in extrusion and heat, and a lot of these machines are open air printers, so they're cooling at different rates. But one of the things that we found is that they do have these kind of microscopic air holes. And what they told me was, well, this is wartime medicine, and when you're at war, you need a backup to your backup, and this is the backup to their existing supply of N95s is what they have. The backup is, I'm trying to find more. The backup to the backup is our masks, which they identified as a step above their doctors using handmade masks, bandanas, and socks. And so they actually are working around scenarios where their doctors might be wearing bandanas and socks, which is the scariest fucking thing I ever heard.
That is
and
so
made me go,
hardcore.
okay, you know what? Our masks are fine.
Yeah.
In that case, our masks are fine. But we have had to, Keck has produced a waiver, a liability waiver for us and all of the people in our group. So all of us are able to sign a waiver that basically says that we're producing this material. It's handmade. It's DIY. It's a backup material. And Keck knows what they're getting. But they have tested it and proved it to a certain extent that at least it's better than them going other routes.
Yeah.
Of course.
Wow, that's incredible. And then the face shields, I presume, are the clear things you wear, and that's in addition to a whole list of other equipment, but one of those things would be a mask, right?
Yeah, in the ideal situation, which I think currently this is true, you wear a mask and then you have the shield on, which protects the doctor, nurse, healthcare professional from droplets of bodily fluids that you don't want near you. One of the interesting things, as I mentioned, we were fortunately able to immediately start production because while Cornell Medicine had tested and verified the product, and so in terms of liability, they said, yes, this is what we want, we're good to go. When you have a network of amazing designers and engineers and architects and makers working together, so many people, and they are, they mean well. They want to change the design to, increase efficiencies for print time or things like that. And that's actually been one thing that both myself and my colleague Kirsten have had to be really mindful of, like, no, don't change don't change the design. This is,
right.
The rings are really important. It has to do with how you take it off your head so that your hands aren't near your face. Or there's a sweat guard, which, collects perspiration so it's not dropping and, down your face. And some people have wanted, and again, they're well-meaning, they want to omit that because it actually adds to the print time. It's like, no. And every time, if the design is undermined, then you're potentially delivering a product that hasn't, been approved by the people that really know what they're doing and what they need. And so, those constraints, I think they've been really important to adhere to.
It's interesting hearing from the three of you talk about this issue because, obviously most of the press that covers these masks and what architects are doing and how they're contributing is a very positive kind of press, which it should be. And I fully understand that. But I think for you guys and being so involved, you see the reality of the situation. And for certainly, I appreciate the fact that, that you're honest in saying that it's great what we're doing, but this is a drop in the bucket, and that there are frustrations that you are feeling, internally as human beings through this process. Do you think it's important that the general public or all the architects out there, are exposed to that side of the conversation as well, and not just the positivity of we're contributing and we're doing good, but the other aspect of that this is, as Alvin was saying, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing, and I feel like I have to do it, and also it's still not enough.
Absolutely. I think we should all be outraged about the situation we're in, and as you said before, we're a first world country, or a supposedly first world country, and we were given a roadmap. We were told that the thing was coming. We were shown examples of how to deal with it. We were shown examples of how not to deal with it, and we ignored all of them. And there has to be some culpability on this. We're all paying the price, and we're all trying to do what we can to, help others. And then there's others that are protesting, pretending that this thing isn't happening, saying that we need to open up again. And I think there's this kind of weird situation we're in right now, which is this kind of post-fact society that seems to be able to kind of position ideals ahead of anything else, and then say that the facts don't matter. But in this case, the facts are resulting in lives, and the frustration, I think, is something that has to be able to motivate people to say, science is a real thing.
Right. It's so peculiar that now we have to say that, and that it's something that has to be understood and it's up for debate. But I guess that's the reality that we're in.
It's so weird for people to talk about science like it's a faith.
Yeah.
So Alvin, you were saying that you're a father, you're a teacher, you're an architect, you have your own business, you have kind of all of those hats you have to wear, and now you're wearing the hat of one of the guys who's making masks. What is your guys' role in this whole initiative? Are you kind of the intermediate person between, I don't know, the mayor of LA or the universities that partner in and the people who make the mask at home? Do you kind of manage them, if I can say that, or?
Well, so as the operation has grown now, like the first week I was drowning, like literally drowning. Like I was, 18 hours a day, every day, doing nothing but this.
Wow.
Now it's gotten to the point where I've been able to delegate a little bit. We've gotten a little bit more organized. I have one person who's just responsible for supply chain, looking at sourcing materials, getting things distributed to different members in terms of who's running low on filament, who needs filament, how do we get it to them, who's donating filament. I have another person, so that was a woman named Victoria Dam, who's a graduate student at USC. Rachel Hamilton basically is responsible for production. She keeps track of the inventory, keeps track of what we're producing, where it's going, who needs it. Alex Jamraz is another graduate student who's responsible for deliveries and getting things distributed. We have 7 delivery locations throughout the city so that people don't. Basically, the important thing is nobody is going to the hospital. Only the authorized people that are authorized for drop-offs are doing the drop-offs at the hospital. So we have bins located throughout the city that people can go and drop off. And then we have a tagging protocol for labeling things so that the hospital knows what they're getting, what the material is, when it was printed, which machine it was printed on. And so we can trace things and track things. And then all of this stuff is now kind of moving up in a way where we're working with the city. The mayor of LA put out an open call to all architects, engineers, manufacturers, fabricators in the city to fill out a survey so that he can get an inventory of all the machines that the city has at its disposal, and we can strategize around what we can do as a city. I'm also working with the city on a grant where we're looking at, what we have, like a 3-tiered strategy where we're calling what we're doing right now as the quote unquote Minutemen, or like the kind of militia model of like just kind of, rallying the troops at a ground up level. And then the next phase is what I'm working on right now, which is what we're calling the kind of rapid cluster manufacturing. So what we're trying to do is develop print farms where we can get large numbers of printers. And so one of the things I'm doing at USC is I spoke with the dean, and we're now looking at producing a print farm of 20 3D printers, which will help us increase our production levels quite rapidly, but also thinking about it as a sort of legacy for our students, where after the pandemic is over, we will redistribute those 20 3D printers into the studios and make them available for free to all of the students, trying to make 3D printing a more equitable kind of resource, where right now it's kind of reserved for the students that have the ability to pay for it, whether it's paying for them externally or within the school, or paying for their own machines. And then taking that same idea to the level of the city, where I'm working with the mayor's office on a grant to try to purchase 4,000 3D printers for the city of Los Angeles to create a 4,000 strong 3D print farm that could produce 26,000 masks a day, but also allows us to be nimble and agile enough to switch course if we suddenly need more ventilator parts or suddenly need more whatever. But then after the pandemic, they would be redistributed to all LAUSD schools as part of their STEM curriculum. And with a training program, we're working with MakerBot to kind of look at a training program which would produce certified 3D printing instructors, but would also produce certified 3D printing technicians upon graduation if they go through this program. Wow. Which by the current counts we're looking at in LAUSD, if 1 out of 10 high school graduates next year gets that certification, that would produce 10,500 certified 3D printing technicians ready for employment the first year. So we're trying to think in multiple strategies about this, both in a kind of pandemic mode. Like I was telling Jenny earlier, we're thinking about this kind of like the London Olympics in the fact that they looked at it as a kind of Olympic mode and a legacy mode, as opposed to the Beijing Olympics, where it was just Olympic mode and then Olympic carcass afterwards. Yeah. Now we're looking at it as pandemic mode being the kind of large-scale assembly of a rapid 3D printing cluster, which then gets disassembled and distributed for kind of civic infrastructure afterwards. But then also thinking about how it could be very quickly reassembled if there's another pandemic, whether it's an earthquake or another illness or whatever it is, that there's an ability that the city has to kind of put out this call to arms and reassemble this farm and manufacture what it needs without having to wait for other people to respond.
I want to speak to that legacy mode, which I think the Olympics is a great analogy because it's such a difficult thing to do, right? I want to speak to that legacy mode and then bring it back to the technical, because I think we're entering very quickly a situation in which this pandemic will be deployed for many different agendas. And one of those agendas will be the destruction, the kind of divestment from urbanism, which in this country is a wave, right? That sort of, that we're still in from the mid 20th century in many ways. But there will be a lot of pseudoscience and a lot of phobia of density, phobia of all the things that we associate with cities for some time. So I think it's important that as we do this work, we're getting very technical, so that we have the technical repertoire to push back against that. So as the technical things, a couple things I want to say. As far as face PPE, we're talking about face shield and face mask are two different things. And between that, there's a face harness. So one thing I think we have to be careful about as a discipline is dividing people into kind of like the talkers and the doers, right? Because we just kind of skipped over what was happening at Princeton, because maybe I'm in this conversation as a talker. But what we've been focused on is what we can do with flat sheet approaches, because we have the Zune, which is a CNC blade. And so we started off with the 3D Verkston from Operation PPE, working with Hillier, which is a small office, which we basically have this kind of small town approach as far as the distribution, teaming up with this local office that then takes them sort of 20, 50 at a time to hospitals. But we've also introduced a totally flat sheet version that came from Liverpool called the McEwen, MCQN, no family relation to me, this person named Adrian McEwen. But I think I followed him on Instagram because of his last name. And an ER doctor here in Princeton reviewed the MCQN design and gave it a thumbs up. So we're going to do a few hundred of those this week, in addition to 500 of the shields for the Berkston. And if we can convince the local healthcare workers to go with the flat sheet MCQN, we could easily do 1,000 MCQNs per week with just 3 students in one machine. The thing that we've been working on that Jenny Sabin brought some intelligence to is the face harness, which is basically a kind of attempt to really deal with the bandana as something that could be a temporary mode of something that's a little bit more codified within the hospital environment. So not a bandana per se, but just cut fabric with a face harness that basically attaches and allows the fabric to be swapped out. One of my concerns, something I don't think that the medical professionals can speak to, but when you really dive in technically to the CDC guidelines around contingency supplies and things like that, we talk about this as a story of protecting healthcare workers, but it's actually also a story of protecting patients.
Yeah.
I mean, the story of PPE, not like what we're doing at Princeton, right? The story of PPE shortage. The CDC guidelines are for reusing masks throughout a day, and the real contamination there is cross-contamination between patients. So the more that we can do as designers, even to speculate ways of creating possible a system for these surfaces to be thrown away and just kind of swapped out literally every 15 minutes. That's what we're trying to use this kind of small town and sort of, high research resource situation at Princeton to figure out.
You started to allude to, all three of you, about how this affects the profession and what we do on a larger scale. And I feel like one of the things you were saying, Mitch, is that it's interesting that it takes almost one, that we're kind of always in a time of crisis, which I kind of agree with, but it takes the pandemic specifically to launch what's currently happening and to have people in the profession start to really take advantage of the technologies and the modes of working that we've been working toward. That's a terrible paraphrasing of what you said. But I wonder, in more specifically, in what ways you think it's going to change how we do things.
Well, I mean, here's the thing is that, a lot of folks can be professional and work in situations of crises and do so. But I think to the extent that this pandemic is a major shift for architects, it also reveals kind of how privileged and kind of bourgeoisie our profession is. And so, this pandemic, it's flatter than other crises as far as its impact, and it's hitting the U.S. and England. So it's hitting the countries that, in a way, have been that are the places where design culture has been proliferating for some time. So I think, it reveals more about us than it does about the pandemic in some ways, that's the case. But, I think that we then have an opportunity to catch up for the lost time. We should have had these shifts, during other recessions, during the AIDS crisis, during housing shortages. I mean, we had a lot of opportunities to kind of, question our bubbles. But this one is just a little bit more obvious for us.
Well, I think it's also highlighting a lot of those bubbles in a very different way, where, like, let's say things about, just the ability to social distance is a privilege, and I, saw a recent article coming out of India where they talked about literally washing your hands as a privilege, because in India, washing your hands means you have running water.
Right.
Social distancing means that you have a single family home, or an ability to be in your own space. And I think something we're seeing now with, like, let's say remote learning is there's also the kind of issues that are going around about, like, students not having some of the things that we all take for granted as being a given, like a good internet connection or a laptop per person in the household, or, things that, or even just a house where they have space to work in by themselves. Because I think those are all things that are becoming more and more exposed now in terms of the inequities that exist even within our privileged culture. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that, my wife was on the phone with someone the other night, and they were talking, and he said something I thought was really poignant. And he said that, we may not be part of the 1%, but we're definitely part of the 2%, in terms of being able to. For me, social distancing means being home with my wife and kids in my single family house with a backyard in a nice neighborhood, working from home, still getting paid.
Yeah.
And that is not the reality for everyone.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I remember seeing an article that some of the disparities were becoming much more obvious for students because of the Zoom backgrounds. If they weren't using a virtual background, that students, when they went off to college, it's kind of like you're starting on a blank slate, sort of, and students aren't aware of, like, what their backgrounds are necessarily, right? Assuming that you don't have someone wearing Gucci shoes and not Gucci shoes. And then because everyone's interacting virtually, that you see where they live. And it's like, oh wow, you live in a mansion, and I don't live in a mansion. I live in a trailer home or something else. It's interesting also because the Project PPE is, and the architects' involvement in it is, like, architects have participated and aided in times of crisis before, right? So an easy thing was, I believe it was Sugar Raban who had designed a cardboard tube, a temporary shelter a few years ago for an earthquake or something. I could be mistaken. But architects intervening in that way is something that's happened before. In this case, it's a little bit different because, we wouldn't typically say that face shields, face masks, and face harnesses are architecture. And I think that's interesting. And I think it's also fascinating that the three of you are kind of championing this effort. But, Jenny and Mitch, your practices are already established as being on the outer boundaries of what the general public would think of as architecture anyway. Do you think that's the reason why you were able to kind of jump in and take charge of this?
I think for me it was maybe a bit, it just seemed obvious. I guess it's a bit simpler. So as I mentioned, because my lab has 3D printers and, because I've been working with these technologies and methods for making, and I think even more importantly, because I've been collaborating with people across disciplines for many years now, leveraging that space and immediately taking action seemed really logical. So I don't think it was necessarily, thinking through the products somehow relating to the experimental work that I do, but thinking through the fact that we could do something, okay, took a look at that file, that makes sense. I can immediately start printing that and thinking through methods for being efficient around the design of a schematic. So I would say I put more time into designing the schematic for the network and interaction and distribution and working with people on that than I did in kind of just the basics of file transfer to the printer, get the print going and so on. But that's also to say, that part of that ease comes with years of working with these technologies and these types of materials. And I'm fortunate to have a lab and colleagues that are familiar with these processes. But one thing that I think is really interesting relative to what we were just talking about, in the kind of early stages at the beginning of digital fabrication, some of my heroes like Bernard Cash, they were certainly interested in the technologies, but they were really interested in the critical project that they saw as a possibility, that through 3D printing and digital fabrication, CNC and so on, that mass customization afforded a democratic space, an informal space that is political and can engage issues of social justice and break barriers and reach larger communities and networks that may otherwise not have access. And so I think about some of those early pioneers in the 90s who were interested in this critical project, who then I think became quite disgusted with where it went, we spent maybe 15 years kind of navel gazing, like trying to figure out what to do with these tools, which in many ways I think had to take place. Like I think the formal explorations of these tools and trying to figure out this whole shift, trying to figure out what this whole shift was about, both pedagogically, how it's impacting the way we can practice, how we do research, how we collaborate. I think that exploration, that kind of inquiry was important. But what I'm really excited about is, through projects like this and others that I think Mitch has mentioned and Alvin, that we're perhaps re-engaging and also giving rise to a critical project that is really necessary, I'm excited to see where that goes next. That that these networks that we've tapped into and we've helped to coordinate and build. I'm looking forward to seeing what the next projects are. Right.
And when you say critical project, you mean one that has more to do with the freedom of the informal network and the democratic modes of production, as opposed to a project that's purely about the technical possibilities and formal possibilities of whatever technologies.
Yeah, I'll give a specific example. Bernard Cash with his partner at the time, they started their workshop, which they called Objectile, and they were the first to develop a website where anyone could go and adjust parameters, and they would get the file, and then they would fabricate it, and then they would ship it out to you. And he authored, the first examples of panel CNC products. So you think about the plywood CNC products we're all used to seeing. He was interested in how design could then be put out into the world. And through digital fabrication, and that, authorship could be leveraged at a kind of community level about, sort of connection. But when he started to see, the same materials and fabricated architectural elements show up in boutique hotels, I think he became a bit disgusted, right? It's like, okay, so this is now, mass customization is now for the elite. It's if you have the tools and you have the budget to afford these non-standard kind of different types of material treatments and structures and so on. So that's what I mean. I'm really excited about the fact that some of those early seeds that were very much a part of digital fabrication are very much present in Operation PPE. And I think, for us, we've been pushing forward in other avenues. And so I don't think it's just about the urgency of this crisis, but it's also about what we can do next, right? And to extend that critical project.
Yeah, my practice outside of academia, McEwen Studio and office, tends to do work more at urban design scale. Like there's a neighborhood in Detroit, on the east side of Detroit. We did a neighborhood framework plan that was led by a landscape architecture firm, because a lot of the neighborhood is now mostly kind of open space. And for me, jumping into this was, in a way, part of an urban practice. And I think that, with working at the neighborhood scale or urban scale, there's a notion of community engagement that I think also needs to be rethought. And the way that we're engaging with PPE, where we're getting feedback, we're field testing, to me feels like a mode of listening that I want to see more at the urban scale. I think it's easy to kind of perform listening as something that takes a long time. And if you're working on a project for 2 years, that somehow means that you've really listened to the community. It can't just mean you've dragged something out. Whereas, if we're talking to a doctor and we drop something off and the doctor picks it up and then gives us some feedback and we make those changes, there's an iterative act of listening that I sometimes get to see it at the urban scale work that I do, but I hope that, it's something that I can build more technical capacity around, and that we can shift towards treating the city as something that we work on in a more iterative way.
That's really interesting to hear, because I think like one of the big questions is, how does this particular project impact the profession or impact what you guys are going to do afterwards, your own practices and things like this. And maybe in that question, like, one would assume that we're just thinking about the gap between, well, we're talking about a 3D printed object versus architecture or urban design, which is much larger scale. How do these things relate at all? But what's fascinating is it seems like the three of you are talking about that some of the most important benefits to this PPE project for the three of you is the lasting legacy. Like you were talking about the Olympics, and having 3D printers will have another life in educating adolescents. But also it's the mode of working, and it's more about, if this is a successful project that takes advantage of this alternate way of working, then maybe that can get applied to other things that are not just about 3D printing.
It's more
Is
about,
that right?
yeah, and social aspects, right? Yeah, how do you interact with people? How do you bring the community together in the flow of working, but also trying to, raise those topics up?
I mean, is that an accurate assessment of what we've been hearing?
I think so. I mean, I think it's interesting what Jenny was saying, because I didn't think about that with Bernard Cash, and like you're absolutely right. Like this kind of return to the open source, which at one point in the kind of disciplinary conversation surrounding computation and digital fabrication was really about not only the kind of sharing of the designs themselves, but also the sharing of the knowledge that other people could build off on. And it was, in the beginning, I think it was totally common for people to publish their scripts online and make them available to everybody so everybody could download them. And then the goal was not for people to plagiarize. The goal was for people to build on, right? To learn and to augment. And like my good friend Mark Fornes used to get so sick of people plagiarizing his scripts that he still kept publishing them, but he would always write errors into them. on purpose, right? And so that nobody could just download them and run them, that you had to have some knowledge of coding to catch the error, and then you could do something else with it. And I think that was probably the thing that kind of killed the whole open source thing, was like suddenly the Voronoi showed up everywhere, and every student had a Voronoi project, but nobody knew how they did it. Like the student only knew that they downloaded it somewhere, hit execute, and ended up with something. And I think now we're at this kind of moment where that return to the open source is less about the, let's say, dissemination of knowledge or the sharing of the information, but more about the collaboration and the kind of mobilization. Mm-hmm. And in terms of what Mitch was talking about, can also be looked at as a model for how we re-engage with the actual constituents that we're designing for. Because we're I think all too often operating in our own internal vacuum. I find myself guilty of this a lot. And I think it's one of the things that I talk about with my wife, who's not an architect, about, like, let's say, academia is oftentimes what I would call a circle jerk. Like, it's a bunch of people getting around together, getting off on each other, but really not doing any procreation, and like, if we were to think about, like, the fact that what we're doing is theoretically affecting the lives of many, you should probably be more engaged with the lives of those many.
One connection I want to make to what Alvin's saying there, the examples that Alvin was giving about the privilege of social distancing, that is something that I could also relate to Detroit, as far as there are water shortages where people's water have been cut off because they're not paying these out of scale water bills. And it's something I've been obsessed with for years, and I've written multiple articles about it. And it's I feel like we need to have more capacity in the discipline, not just to care about certain things, but to kind of take the risks to actually figure out how to speculate within these realms that are so charged with significance, right? We're comfortable speculating in these realms where it's purely formal, right? But when you talk about people don't have water in a major American city, all of a sudden we want to get conservative, and we want to go back to the known kind of, the conventions, the professional order of, we're not supposed to deal with this and that's somebody else's problem. So for me, that's an important thing to recognize, that in this country, we also have these extremes.
I wonder if the three of you feel like part of the reason why a lot of designers or architects are hesitant to engage in that way, or to adopt or try these other more collaborative, like really collaborative ways of working, if somehow the ego is involved, because I think we're coming from a tradition where it was the one grand master that designed the whole thing, and he was the auteur of the entire building. And I wonder if that being kind of that way of thinking is being kind of passed down, if that's what's one of the reasons why some people are less open to what you're talking about.
I would like to think that people are shifting. There are a lot of buzzwords around collaboration and transdisciplinary and innovation. When it gets down to it, though, collaboration is really hard, especially across disciplines where you have different structures in place for how you lead your day, how you publish, how you go after grants, how you teach. But the role of design and the importance of design, the abilities that we bring to the table in terms of synthetic thinking and speculative thinking, and the ability to project into a multitude of parameters, to synthesize those constraints and then to form a plan. There's a huge need for that thinking. And so the role of design in the context of collaboration across disciplines, and I think we're seeing this in real time in the PPE initiatives that we're all spearheading and working on, individually, but also together on, we're seeing that play out. And I think science, they have a model in terms of, authorship and how, not, people contribute to knowledge. I mean, sure, there are star scientists, but you never see a single author on a paper. You see multiple authors, and there's a structure in place for that. And I've adopted that structure in my lab for all of the papers that we produce. My name is always last as senior author. And, the first author is, the student that has been spearheading things. So I think there is space for people to be visionaries and innovators and to lead. But I agree. I think architecture for many years now has had a really bad model in place in terms of credit. And it's such a falsehood to think that a single person designs and produces a building, if that's, what your practice is. And so I would like to think that things are shifting a bit. I think the three of us certainly are helping to do that. But maybe you're right. Maybe the kind of ego and the desire to maintain a kind of single authorship keeps people away from doing this work. But I think they're going to probably get left behind.
I also wonder, I think there's a lack of empathy that's even bigger than the ego dimension. I mean, one example is was it called Greffenfall, that tower, not tower, the housing in London that burned, really because of austerity, kind of eating away at any kind of standards in building codes. And that should have been a huge crisis in the profession. And it wasn't. It should have been a moment when we as a profession talked about austerity and how austerity was challenging the very terms in which we could work. And we didn't. I don't know about those conversations. And I think it's because we look around and we could say that none of us would have lived in that housing. We would live in London and we wouldn't live there, So it's a combination of, I think, a lack of empathy and a kind of overdetermined kind of status of privilege, with like a little sandwich of white supremacy in there. That then kind of, just recreates itself.
Yeah. Little sandwich.
But I feel like a lot of architects have like very strong opinions maybe about those disasters that happen. But to me, the lack is the existence of a community within our profession. I feel like we all have opinions. We can all judge and discuss those topics. But, like you said, the AIA isn't necessarily the best person or group to kind of speak for the community. And there is really none like big platforms out there that would allow people to come together. And I think that's where like your Project PPE is really good. It's because it's just proving to all of the architects that we can come together without needing a big organization to do it for us, right? It just needs to have some people who have an initiative and people who believe in it and just start joining the movement. So I'm hoping that the architecture community is going to see PPE as a wake-up call, like, hey, we're all doing this profession. We all have our way of thinking, and there's things that we know need to change, and we know we can make a change. So let's just come together and do something about it.
And have the three of you had any thoughts about how the pandemic, and this is kind of zooming out, is going to affect buildings, cities, or how citizens engage with those things? Because this is a question that kind of comes up pretty often now.
I could see one version of this depending upon kind of how quickly the science shifts and how quickly public health shifts. But I could see one version of this where we enter a mode where we have trade-offs between the kind of controls that we have over building occupancy, right? All of that stuff is highly coded already, right? But it's coded in terms of fire and in terms of live load. That those things might be coded somehow in terms of public health, right? In terms of viral load. And it's already starting at some level. The kinds of research proposals that are coming out are very concerned with this 6-foot dimension. How could you even just sort of imagine the regulations of restaurants or the kind of standards for retail opening up again with this? So to the extent that becomes codified, a kind of notion of viral load, I think this and we have a history in architecture, folks like Coop Himmelblau and House Record Co. working on face shields and this kind of thing, right? But it was from an astronaut kind of imagination or different kinds of media. But our intelligence around these things could become very significant, depending upon how this plays out.
Yeah, because the first solution is just to keep your distance and be remote, right? But would there be a solution that's kind of halfway between being like really close to each other or really far from each other, where design could come and develop something?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Right, or maybe there's got to be some interplay between building standards and personal protective standards.
Yeah.
Right.
So like the live load, the viral load of any space would change depending upon if everyone is wearing a face shield or a mask or gloves. I mean, it sounds a little nutty, but when you think about the kind of controls that are coded into our spaces, they're pretty significant.
Yeah.
But I think in general, maybe the way I would look at it and kind of touches on, the previous answer from Jenny, or the question about like wearables, if those things are architecture, is that, one thing I've come to, discover about my own views about architecture, the more I do it and the longer I do it in terms of like the expansion of our discipline beyond traditional buildings, is really thinking about architecture as a space or a place to imagine alternatives, and it's just a place where we can think about how things can be different, whether or not it is about what we wear or the codes that we design by or what architecture is. Like, we have an ability as architects that we can, I use this kind of idea to sell a lot of potential students in terms of thinking about, the value of an architectural education as something that I would argue is the last remaining true liberal arts, where we can kind of come in and you could receive an architectural education. You learn about politics, you learn about science, you learn about building, you learn about history, you learn about culture, and you learn how to package all of these things, develop an argument, convince people about them, and meet a deadline. And that kind of applies to everything and anything, as long as you're looking at these things as trying to lateral problem solve and think about them as a way to do things differently, or a way to kind of attack a particular problem. And I think now what we're getting out of this is that the context is changing for those problems, whether or not it's, a political issue or a public health issue. And what we're seeing very clearly is that a public health issue has become a political issue.
Yeah, it's very, very fascinating. And I think what's interesting for us too is picking up the emotional aspect of all this for the three of you who are, and on the forefront of this. But also that somehow I feel like a lot of the discussion and what you guys had said, it does root back to people having a little more empathy for others that are not in their same situation. And I think that somehow ties into collaboration, community, openness, and all of it. And it's so odd to us because we've spoken with architects of a lot of different generations, and I've not. And maybe it's just the circles that we operate within, but everyone that I meet who is, I don't know, like mid-40s or younger, right? They have no interest in being assholes. And they all seem to be kind of led by this wanting to do good, and they acknowledge that there's an emotional and human side to it that's driving their ways of operating. And I think that's a great thing, and it was certainly interesting to hear that this was something that the three of you feel as well.
My wife might disagree with you there.
Well, we covered a lot of different things. Is there... no,
go for it.
Okay, well, you inhaled, though. That's confusing. Was there anything else that we did not cover, though, that you wanted to talk about? If not, then I would ask if anyone is listening and they want to participate somehow, how can they do that?
On our end, the best place to go is sabinlab.com, sabinlab.com, where we have all of our Operation PPE information and files available, and also information on how to get in touch with both myself and other collaborators that are involved.
We have our work at Princeton up at box.princeton.edu, which is the black box website. The Rapid PPE is what we call our initiative, and that's at the top of box.princeton.edu. And we have a full agenda document that if you email box@princeton.edu to become an editor and start adding, if there's something outside of face PPE, we've got categories including incubation boxes and others. But I think especially if you're at an institution that has a Zoom and you're in a kind of a hot spot of the pandemic, then please look at the files that we're uploading, because we're really trying to focus on CNC cutting techniques for PPE.
And for us, we don't have a website yet. We are working on that right now, which should be up shortly this week. But in the meantime, if you go to my Instagram, the link is in my bio, Synthesis DNA. So in my bio, you can download all of our files. We have files and instructions for our pseudo N95 masks, our face shields, and instruction manuals for how to assemble them.
And now if our listeners do not have access to a 3D printer, is there any other way that they can help out?
Laser cutter and Zoom.
Also on our website is not up yet. It'll be up this week, but on our website there will be a link to donate. So we are looking for material donations, gifts in kind, money, anything like that. We have some people in our network that don't actually have 3D printers or laser cutters or any sort of machine, but are operating just as runners. So they are basically distributing material, doing material drop-offs and pickups. I'm actually kind of amazed at how this network is mobilized. Like, there's one guy who just drives around and drops filament off at people's houses. And like, I put on I'll shout out to Slack and say, I'm running low on PLA. And then the next morning I go to my front step and there's 3 spools of filament on my porch. Wow. And yeah.
Yeah. On our end, on the same site, sabinlab.com, there's information on where to donate PPE if you have it on hand. There's also a Slack channel that you can join to see what's going on across Cornell and beyond. So, if you're able to volunteer time to help distribute materials, like Alvin was just discussing, or helping to deliver product to New York City, there are lots of opportunities to get involved.
Great.
Very good. So this episode will probably come out next week. Alvin, do you have the web address of the website once it goes up? Do you know what it's going to be?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I just know it will be under the USC architecture website. They're putting a page up, and right now the big hurdle is me getting the approval for a emergency disaster fund at USC that does not get taxed by the university. Right. In terms of them taking a part of it and it just going straight to our efforts.
Right. Okay. Very good.
I should also mention too, if people want to donate, for the purchase of materials and so on, Ithaca Generator is running a GoFundMe. We're not able to take direct donations for materials at Cornell, but through Ithaca Generator, we're doing that and then distributing the materials in the network.
Well, Alvin, Jenny, and Mitch, this has been really, really interesting. We thank you so much for coming on here and having this dialogue. The review were awesome. And again, obviously, thank you for what you're doing regarding PPE and the profession. This was really lovely, so thank you.
Thanks for having us. And Mitch and Jenny in particular, I just want to say thank you for inspiring me, because I wouldn't have done it without you guys.
Oh, thank you for doing so much for LA.
Mitch, I'll talk to you tomorrow. And Alvin, we still need to figure out what we're gonna.
Yeah. I will say that there's definitely like a little bit of Zoom fatigue going on my end over here.
Yeah.
It is like I am zoomed out, but.
And we're extra appreciative of you participating because of that. Yeah, Zoom is taking over our lives. Thanks, guys.
At least it's going better than the happy hour.
Oh, no, we don't want to talk about the happy hour. We hosted a happy hour. We got Zoom bombed like at least half a dozen times. Yeah, no. Not making that mistake again. Password protected.
By a guy named Hugh G. Rexton.
Clever. All right, thanks, guys.
Yeah,
All right,
thanks.
take care,
Thanks
guys.
again. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good to see
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of The Midnight Shorette, and thank you to our guests again. Really enjoyed the conversation. 5 people on Zoom, not the easiest thing, but I think we managed, and I think they had amazing things to say, right?
Yes, and we will make sure to post all the links that were mentioned if you are wanting to join their initiative or support in any way you can. Those will be available on our website. And if you go on their Instagram and website as well.
And if you want to support this show, then please leave us a review in the podcast app. That means a lot to us. We're also on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, and Stitcher, and pretty much everywhere else.
Facebook.
We're not on SoundCloud because they charge money, and that's just ridiculous. They charge money for podcasts. And then social media-wise, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
Yes, and we have a hotline. So if you have any questions, comments, reaction, you also have an initiative you want to share, well, just reach out to the hotline. You can text or leave a voicemail, and we will play it during a recording or get back to you. The number is 213-222-6950. Feel free. You're at home right now. You're on your phone all the time, so you have no excuse.
Absolutely. And we have been receiving some questions recently about the pandemic, and we will try to answer those in one of the recordings coming up. But we'll see. They're big questions. Big conceptual questions. I don't know. Sometimes it's like, I just want to talk about like Tiger King and shit. I don't really, you know what I mean?
Well, that's why you have a hotline for, it's to not talk about those things.
Well, how does the pandemic affect Tiger King? Oh, that's the question right there.
Well, the tiger in the Bronx has the coronavirus.
But save the goods. Save the goods. All right. We really appreciate that you're listening. It means a lot to us. And we're going to move forward through the cloud of the coronavirus. And we appreciate you all. So thank you. And we will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.
And a quick announcement. We have another happy hour coming up next Friday or this Friday, depending on when this episode debuts, on 4/24, right? 4 days after 4/20. And we have some special guests, including the founder of Next Architects, Mr. Adam Dene, and Michael Risica, the young architect. And there's a few others that are joining who are in that kind of vicinity of helping out the architecture community. I think this is going to be a fun one. I think it's going to be helpful. So any of you listening who have questions about career paths, success, all that fun stuff, you should definitely drop by and ask questions. These are all people interested in helping others, and they're nice too. Nice people. Yeah,
and so the happy hour would happen from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m.-ish Pacific Standard Time, and the Zoom ID will be on the post on our Instagram as well as in our bio. There will be a link. And the website. You just need to message us to get the password because we don't want Zoom bombers. So
no Zoom bombers.
Just, send a message.
Okay, everybody. Thanks again, and we will talk to you again next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.